Well, thousands staged another weekend protest in the Russian capital of Moscow to demand free elections. It comes a week before regional polls in the capital, in which most opposition candidates are barred from taking part. The weekend demonstrations have turned into the biggest sustained protest movement in Russia since 2013. Well, back then, crowds had gone out in the streets to protest electoral fraud. Well, for more on the march in the Russian capital, we go to Julia Chapman. She joins us from Moscow. Julia, what's the situation like there where you are now?
Well, the situation on the ground today didn't unfold quite as expected. It was expected that the protest would be met with arrests because this was an unsanctioned protest, and previous such protests had been met with a very heavy hand from authorities. But that's not how things went at all. We saw people setting off along Moscow's central boulevard ring earlier today, and they were allowed to walk freely. They marched for about an hour to the central Pushkin Square, where they continued to gather. And there they were met by riot police, but they were not interfered with. The riot police surrounded the square, and there was a voice coming over the tannoy telling people they should disperse because they were attending an unsanctioned protest. But we haven't seen any of the arrests that we have seen in previous weeks. Of course, we did see two very large protests which were met with a very heavy hand from authorities. More than 2,000 people were arrested at those protests, but that hasn't been the case today.
So clearly quite a peaceful protest then. Any incidents of violence or altercations? And what have you also heard about those detained at previous rallies?
Well, no, we haven't really seen any violence. There was a small scuffle in Pushkin Square where one protester had their poster torn apart. But other than that, it's been a very peaceful day of events. Many of the people who had been previously arrested at previous protests were released very quickly. A number of the opposition figures who were arrested for calling for unsanctioned protests have also been released. And one of them, in fact, took part in the protest today, Lyubov Sobol, who has emerged as one of the leaders of this protest movement. She was the one leading the charge as the protesters marched down that central Moscow boulevard, and she made it all the way to Pushkin Square and wasn't arrested. Ahead of previous protests, she was arrested before she even managed to leave her front door. So certainly a different approach from the authorities. The prevailing theory being that they've realized that the more attention they give these protests, the more arrests they make, the more likely the supporters are to come out onto the streets.
Right. Of course, the big question is, what will the protest manage to achieve? Now, this is the last protest before the vote. What can we expect if the demonstrators' demands are not met?
Well, that's right. This is likely to be the last protest ahead of the elections because the authorities or the officials behind the protests, or the opposition figures behind the protests, are reluctant to hold another one next weekend lest their supporters be arrested and unable to vote on Sunday. The demands that they have been calling for previously were to allow the opposition candidates onto the ballot paper for this upcoming election. It's becoming increasingly clear that that will not happen. And in fact, the opposition figures today at the protests said this was a protest against political repression, not necessarily a protest calling for the opposition figures to be allowed on the ballot paper. They've accepted that that's very unlikely to happen on this occasion, but they want to make their voices heard about the fact that they don't believe that this is going to be a democratic vote next weekend. Nevertheless, they aren't calling for a boycott of these local and regional elections next week. They want their supporters to attend the vote. They want them to vote anyway, to make their voices heard, and to vote against the ruling United Russia Party. So not a boycott as they've called for in previous elections. They tried to boycott the presidential election in 2018, but they've got a slightly different tact this time around.
Right. Well, it certainly will be interesting to see how that turns out when polling day comes. Thanks so much for that, Julia. Julia Chapman joining us.